In a semester devoted to introducing how we approach different literary forms academically, today we turn our gaze to poetry. I chose William Butler Yeats as a test subject because he touches on a lot of different things we teach here at Monash. He is something of a late romantic. He is a bit of a modernist at times, and he's also Irish and therefore a significant figure in the Writing the Nation syllabus on the emergence of modern Ireland. Whether you like various aspects of Yeats or not might lead you to choose various things on the syllabus or avoid them like grim death. Today I'm going to talk about The Fisherman, Lapis Lazuli and the Circus Animals' Desertion, maybe leaving Lake Isle of Innisfree aside for tutorials, and I'm going to mention some of Yeats's poetics or the theory of poetry and how this might illuminate his compositions. To start off, I'll say something about Yeats's voice as a poet. Whenever we approach a poem, we should ask whether the speaking voice is that of the poet or is that of some invented character. In Yeats's case, it's nearly always himself speaking as Yeats. Unambiguously so in poems like these ones, in which he reflects on his own work, his own life as a poet. I'm going to begin with Yeats's commentary on The Fisherman. In an essay, he introduces the poem as follows. I had met much unreasonable opposition. To overcome it, I had to make my thoughts modern. Modern thought is not simple. I became argumentative, passionate, bitter. When I was very bitter, I used to say to myself, I do not write for these people who attack everything that I value, not for those others who are lukewarm friends. I am writing for a man I have never seen. I built up in my mind the picture of a man who lived, who fished in mountain streams where I had fished. I said to myself, I do not know whether he is born yet, but born or unborn, it is for him I write. So it's a poem in which Yeats creates an ideal audience for his work. The fisherman is a symbol rather than a real person, a vehicle for Yeats's aesthetics or artistic values. And I pick out that word opposition from the quotation as a word that defines Yeats as a poet, his sense of opposition to popular tastes and convention. Also his attraction to personae that are somehow his opposites. The fisherman's straightforward rural existence is an example of a way of life that the poet idealizes in contrast with his own life. And there's also a juxtaposition of this figure with the crowd, the hated crowd as it turns out. So feelings of opposition persist in Yeats's work. There's a slight self-rebuke in the opening lines with this hint that Yeats has neglected his ideal.
Although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill, in grey Connemara clothes, at dawn to cast his flies. It's long since I began to call up to the eyes this wise and simple man.
Formally, the poem, quite like the fisherman himself, is straightforward. It occurs in quatrains or groupings of 4 lines with an A-B rhyme scheme. And Yeats doesn't separate these out into individual verses, putting spaces between them. One quatrain can flow into the next, and one line often flows into the next too. Yeats uses enjambment, running onto the next line rather than concluding his clauses within individual lines. There are variations in when the stresses occur in each line. There are always 3 stressed syllables in each line, but they fall in different places. You'll notice that some of these lines contain 6 syllables, but some have 7. This flexibility, along with the enjambment, the flow of quatrains, and the freedom in where the stresses can lie, creates the easeful, meditative air wanted for Yeats's subject, the serene fisherman. And the language is intentionally functional here, very straightforward, in keeping with the wise and simple man. We get the word grey repeated, which is almost confrontational in its lack of variation. Now, we know you're a first-rate poet, Yeats. You could do better than that if you wanted. He is deliberately resisting ornate or elaborate poetic language. Both the clothes and the plate are grey, so they are alike called grey. Connemara fixes us to a place in the west of Ireland, and with that, notions we might associate with romantic traditions of the primitive and rural lifestyles offering a kind of purity, redoubled here in the associations of dawn as purifying. It's a vision of bare beauty. Yet subtle complexities come to our attention. The assonance or internal rhyme of grey place, the alliterations goes, grey, grey, Connemara, close, cast, the field rhyme of eyes and wise, the nuanced music of this fisherman's existence, a life to which the poet manifests a form of wisdom. But soon the speaker's absorption in this idyll passes, giving way to dissatisfaction and outright anger.
All day I'd looked in the face what I had hoped would be, to write for my own race and the reality. The living men that I hate, the dead man that I loved, the craven man in his seat, the insolent, unreproved, and no knave brought to book, who has won a drunken cheer. The witty man and his joke aimed at the commonest ear, the clever man who cries, the catch-criers of the clown, the beating down of the wise, the great art beaten down.
The poem has changed in quality compared with the opening lines. Look at the heavy punctuation here, for example, which is suited to a kind of catalogue of irritation or a listing of grievances. The sequence begins with Yeats's crisis, the opposition between the ideal of what it is to be a writer and the reality of being a writer. At the heart of this crisis is Yeats's own failure to identify his audience correctly, or his own race. He has realised now that his actual reader is nothing like the pure and wise fisherman, and he turns to those who really have read his work and found fault with it. So it's ideal versus reality, poet versus popular taste, the individual beloved dead man opposed to a hostile crowd of living men, and the poet's association of himself with great art at odds with the joke that appeals to the commonest ear. All of these oppositions taking place. Love in the past tense juxtaposed with hatred in the present. The lexis, or language of the poem, which was simple at first, now becomes more sophisticated because the poet is trying to set himself as an elitist apart from the Philistines who hate high culture, the craven man, the insolent unreproved, and no knave brought to book, with its archaic Shakespearean and therefore literary word knave. The music of these lines becomes harsh and cacophonous in the now unpleasant use of alliteration, the clever man who cries the catch cries of the clown. And that harshness foreshadows an intimation of physical violence in the following lines, in which Philistinism, which rejects culture, is figured as an angry mob. The second verse paragraph completes the imaginative journey of the poem, in which Yeats inverts a common formula, by which I mean it's typical for a meditative poem to begin with an unhappy reality and to escape from that into fantasy, and then to say, well, I better go back to the real world now. For example, that trajectory occurs in Keats's Major Odes. But Yeats is doing the opposite, that he starts off with the fantasy, the ideal world, then he investigates reality and says, no, to hell with that, and he goes back into the imaginary once more.
Maybe 12 months since, suddenly I began, in scorn of this audience, imagining a man and his sun-freckled face and grey Connemara cloth, climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, and the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. A man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream, and cried, before I am old, I shall have written one poem maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn.
Strangely, the end product of all of Yeats's anger is this calm persona, that the fisherman is a kind of corrective, a superior model of audience that Yeats conjures up in his dissatisfaction. And the poet becomes lost in his admiration for this fisherman. It's trance-like, a mesmeric absorption when he talks about the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. Another detail which leaps out is perhaps unusual. The way the poet talks about the poem he might write about the fisherman being maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn, and there's a trepidation, uncertainty in that word maybe, a doubt about the poet's capacity to do justice to his ideal in a work of art. And cold, not seeming a very appealing description on the surface of it. Would we want a cold poem written about us? I think it's something to think about maybe in tutorial. How is cold a desirable attribute in Yeats's poem?